Okay, so over the past couple of weeks, we've been looking at a number of things and doing a number of different kinds of work, and some of that work involves looking at different types of acts of vandalism, and specifically vandalism directed toward works of art, or the term is sometimes iconoclasm. And I have attempted to take pains to distinguish between iconoclasms that are directed against institutions of institutions of colonialist capitalism and injustice, and that not only support systems and hierarchies of power that deny certain individuals and certain positionalities rights and means of surviving and existing in society, but also are based on long colonial histories of exploitation of labor and of theft, right? And in fact, many museums are filled with objects that were stolen either from Asia or from the Middle East or from Africa. And lurking behind my critique of these institutions and these forms of theft, which this critique began as early as believe it or not, 1978. One of my first performance pieces was situated within the period in which the treasures of Tutankhamun were being displayed across the United States. And I did a piece in which I, in a satirical and ironic way, talked about the difference between the way that sort of local Egyptian tomb robbers are described as thieves, but when the British Museum and its archaeologists ransack a tomb and bring its materials back to either England or some other European nation, that's described as archaeology. And so I've been attempting to distinguish between these acts of vandalism, which again, I think in certain instances that word is not significant enough. These acts of vandalism that are directed at institutions, and these acts of vandalism that function as hate speech and racism. And in leading up to this piece, which is another exploration of those ideas, I've suggested a number of different things. I've tried to suggest that in the history of certain kinds of collections of art, there is a history of theft and colonialism that calls for reparation, and this includes those religious institutions that have utilized either art or discursive rhetoric and other performances, right, of their authority to do real damage to real human lives. And recently it's come out that Pope Pius the 12th, I believe it was the 12th, Pope Pius the 12th, which I suppose for Christians is an unfortunate number, since the significance of the number 12 is so great. But that Pope Pius the 12th had a back channel, essentially, to Hitler, and supported the policies of Nazi Germany, including the way that they related to the events unfolding in the destruction of human life surrounding the events of the Holocaust. And I made a suggestion, and it's tongue in cheek. The suggestion is, but it's not entirely insincere, that a gesture of true Christian reparation could be made on the part of the Roman Church if they were to sell the Sistine Chapel and all of the works contained within it, and utilize the proceeds from that sale in some sort of humanitarian effort that would be more closely aligned with the virtues of Christianity than as those virtues are represented in the collection of ostentatious displays of wealth, whether those ostentatious displays of wealth are examples of great works of art or otherwise. And I've also suggested that in the course of the examination, in particular, of a number of works by Barnett Newman, a number of things. I've explored the way that his work means, and what the sublime within that way of meaning, how it's constructed, and the way that it seems to me that it works, and the argument, and I don't know if this argument has been made before, but the argument that I made about a series of works, and this in this series that we're looking at, which is a response to an attack on a painting called "Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue," and I'll talk about the response later, and what this cross is intended to represent. All right, so the three pieces that we looked at, and then I'll, and in discussing those pieces again, and articulating what I made and how I made the claims that I made about those particular works. We'll discuss some of the entailments that follow. But I made the claim for the first set of work is the one-ments, and I made a claim based on the title and the etymology that it refers to one-ment as atonement, and a claim partly based on the timing of the piece and the origin of that series of work in the late 1940s, and it's coinciding in time with the Nuremberg trials, that this piece is in fact about the Holocaust, and that it recognizes within the citation it makes of the trials and the atonement of the trials, it also recognizes the extent to which no trial can be an atonement for the kinds of events that occurred in the framework of the destruction of the Jewish people and other people by the Nazis under Adolf Hitler and that regime of terror. And I talked a bit about the iconology of what Newman sometimes refers to as the zip, the vertical stripe, and I compared it to the in a certain sense, or I hinted at, that the iconography or iconology of that vertical line, in some ways refers to an idea that's also present in the tekenu of the ancient Egyptians, this idea of receiving light from above, from the divine, and I tried to compare that verticality with a similar verticality, or hinted at a comparison of the verticality of the zip with the sacred fire, that is both a giving and a receiving to of God. So in a sense, it's the sacrificial flame that rises, to the heavens, but it's also the receiving of light from the divine that comes from above. So a surrendering to the divine and the giving, up, and the receiving, downwards of a certain kind of gift of the sacred. And in the middle of the discussion of broken obelisk and sorry, the fiber barking outside is distracting me. in the middle of the discussion of the one-ments and broken obelisk, I also discussed the Stations of the Cross and the subtitle of Stations of the Cross, which is, O Lord, why hast thou forsaken me? And I discussed that this is a quotation of Christ, and in its being a quotation of Christ, it's in fact also a quotation of Christ quoting a verse from the Psalms of David. And I discussed the significance of that subtitle also in relationship to the events of the Holocaust and the destruction of the Jewish people. So I've made what's in my mind, and it may not be in anyone else's mind, but what's in my mind, a fairly compelling case that much of Barnett Newman's work, actually has to do with not only Jewishness, but particularly with the experience of Jewishness in relationship to the human destruction of the Holocaust, and I've made, I think, in my mind, and maybe perhaps not in anyone else's mind, but a fairly compelling case that Barnett Newman's reading of this event is in some ways an interrogation of what it means to be abandoned by God or betrayed, and that it's this interrogation, or this this questioning, or this discourse is done in these fairly abstract terms, but whose abstraction itself somehow lends itself to the power and sublimity and the incomprehensible nature of the questions. How can we have been forsaken, and what I've also suggested that beyond perhaps what lies within Newman, but what they suggest to me is what can be the meaning of the Sabbath and a day of worship, after the Holocaust, in the same way that Adorno asks, how can one, write poetry after the Holocaust? And I've tried to answer, these questions, or not answer them, but at least develop them in relationship to some of the aesthetic questions that Newman's paintings raise in relationship to these particular historical moments and these particular events. And I've also suggested that in Newman, in particularly, I have suggested this in relationship to Broken Obelisk and the Broken Obelisk series of work, and even in the way that it was defaced, by this hate speech and criminal vandalism in 1979, that holy and symbolic symbols can be irrevocably destroyed, and And I suggested that in relationship to the image of the swastika that was adopted by the Nazis and used to symbolize and perpetuate the propaganda of human destruction, of not only the Jewish people, but of many different positionalities of people that fell outside of the vision of this totalitarian fascist regime. And so I've suggested that the holiness and the sacredness of that symbol, the swastika, is destroyed and cannot be used because of the way that it was used in the perpetuation of this ideology of terrorism. And what we're looking at is an image, and from there I want to move on to the possibility and the warning that if holy symbols can in fact become desanctified and evacuated of their significance, that in some ways I suppose this is a warning to those individuals who utilize symbols such as the cross to perpetuate acts of destruction, or that fail, right, to respond to the sacredness of human expression and needs that are represented in something like a Barnett Newman painting, right, that speaks from the very center and core of humanity. And I have one of my dogs is scratching at the window, so I'm going to let him in, and then we'll. So before I talk about this image, which is in fact not a representation of the Barnett Newman painting, Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue, after it was vandalized and slashed by someone who either understood its significance in relationship to that field that I'm claiming that Barnett Newman explores, that relates to Jewish identity and the question of belief, and faith, after the Holocaust. I either understood that relationship or didn't, or understood it, in purely aesthetic terms as a response to certain category of abstractionists, including Mondrian and others, and these primary color theorists, and the purely aesthetic principles and values and significances in that discourse, or beyond that, with Newman's interest in the Sublime and what fear means in relationship to the Sublime, either looking at it from a Burkean perspective or beyond that, and perhaps taking into account Kierkegaard's discourse on fear and trembling and its relationship to if you recall, in Soren Kierkegaard, his discussion of fear and trembling refers back to that moment in which Abraham is asked to sacrifice Isaac. And I think that moment, actually, in which Abraham is asked to sacrifice Isaac, and is saved from doing this at the very last moment by either you could take the reading as the voice of a messenger, or of the divine voice itself, the unnameable, that moment of fear and trembling has actually quite a bit to do with the kinds of questions that I think that Newman is asking in his work. And whether the perpetrator of the vandalism of this piece understood any of that or not is not entirely clear to me. What is somewhat more clear to me is the way that the act was read, was interpreted, and deployed as a kind of a political argument in this piece, which is a rather poor representation of a poster that was made following this event called "Who's Afraid of God?" And you can see that the slash in this poster was turned into a cross, and it was made in the 1990s, long after Newman was no longer with us, but by the Archbishopric of Utrecht, which is somewhere in the Netherlands, and is responding to this act, and I suppose that in some strange fashion, the Archbishopric of Utrecht felt a solidarity with the individual who attacked this painting, and there may be a number of different reasons for that, and those reasons may or may not correspond with an understanding of any of those details that I had read into Barnett Newman's work, and the questions they raise in relationship to that broken shaft of light, that broken meeting on the mountain, right? And the reciprocal promise and communication made between the divine and the holy chosen, and so what I want to turn to today is what it means, and I'm not as interested in all of the copyright law and the case that was made, as to whether this was a violation of certain privileges of ownership and the payment of compensation, because I'm afraid that in doing so, the morality of the intentions can get confused with the rights of ownership, right? And I really do want to distinguish those things, because this is in some way what all of this investigation is about: the rights of law versus the morality of deeds, and what I had claimed before about being inherent in my understanding, at least, of broken obelisk, is that the promise of the divine after the events of the Holocaust, the promise of the Creator, and the relationship between the creator as father and protector of a nation. In a sense, that part of God that belongs to the idea of, if we want to say, patriarchy in the positive sense, had been broken. And that broken promise and that broken light and that broken communication, also represents a crisis in faith and a crisis in the identity of community and a crisis in the meaning of what the Sabbath can be, after the breaking of the divine and the divine promise. And in a different way, it represents how a symbol can be broken through the use of a sacred symbol for the purposes of human destruction can be broken. And I've suggested that the acts of Pope Pius XII, were certainly significant enough to damage the sacred symbol of the cross, and I've suggested also that the long duration of the events of the Spanish Inquisition were significant enough to damage the sacredness of the image of the cross. And I've also suggested that the enslavement of Native Americans and African Americans in the United States and justified, via this image of the cross and ideas of how the enslavement, right, of individuals who received and seen as less than human was justified by the salvation of their souls, so that one could effectively, do any harm to them that one saw fit for the purposes of one's economy, because effectively they were better off, because once they had died and succumbed to the forced labor and internment and torture, that they were subjugated to and forced to perform, that then their souls could be transported to this imaginary realm of paradise via the mythology that was largely created after early Christianity, and is very difficult actually to define and to find evidence of in the Gospels themselves, right? And as I've argued, many times, even though we refer to the Christianization of Rome, it's more actually accurate to refer to the Romanization of Christianity. And so all of those things, I have argued, have done damage to this holy symbol, and I have argued that the symbol of the swastika is irreparable and that cannot be used. And if that's in fact the case, then the obvious corollary to this argument is that other sacred symbols can be damaged beyond repair as well. And I didn't quite go so far as to say that all of this is inherent in the idea of the broken obelisk, although I said that some types of significations of breaking of holy vows and promises and symbols and signs are clearly implied, right, by that work. But what I find interesting is that I think we can say this, whether the perpetrator of this act of vandalism knew it or not, and whether the perpetrator of this act of vandalism, thought, he was acting against, capitalism or not. And I'm referring to the vandal, before the image of the damaged painting was turned into a cross and retitled "Who's Afraid of God?" But whatever the intention was, and whether there was ignorance, related to my argument of the meaning of Newman's work or not, right? That he participated in the discourse that is produced by the work, inherently and already present in the discourse of the work. In other words, the discourse of the work is already about damages, right? Damages done to the spirit, damages done to a people, damages done in a request. If we imagine, as I'm imagining, that who's afraid of red, yellow, and blue is that fear and trembling of Abraham in the presence of the demands made by God, to sacrifice, his own child. And it very well could be, because clearly in the series 14 Stations, the subtitle refers to a moment that's very similar, right? Okay, so the passage is originally from, like I said, from the Psalms of David, and then it's repeated by Christ. But that moment of sacrifice, one can't miss the connection between God's sacrifice of his of this child of God, of Jesus, and the sacrifice that God, once asked Abraham to make of his son Isaac, and then withdrew, the request at the last minute. Of course, in the case of Christ, the request is not withdrawn at the last minute, but, perhaps in that moment, Christ is imagining that the request might be withdrawn. It's very likely that, being a good scholar of the Torah, that Christ, was aware of, such a possibility. So, Newman, having, produced this series with such a subtitle, why hast thou forsaken me, could very much, be thinking of that story of the Abraham and Isaac, and asking this question, who's afraid of? And I think there are other significances too, and I don't want to merely imply that that's the only connection here. But what interests me is this reinscription of a holy symbol, and the use of it here as a kind of act of terrorism in a certain sense, on the part of the Archbishopric of Utrecht, and that either refutes the idea that a sacred symbol can be destroyed, through an act of vandalism or destruction, or somehow passes into the sublime of irony, and sees, Newman's point, and yet, as an act of violence, inscribes the cross as like this act of cutting into flesh on this sacrificed painting, and it's almost incomprehensible. And if that's the case, I mean, the terrorism of the act almost seems enough to symbolically, constitute the destruction of the image of the cross. And it doesn't seem to me that that's what the Archbishopric of Utrecht could possibly want to do with this symbol. But it does remind me of an event, in my own life, and I want to narrate that, before leaving this piece and concluding this with, the third, and final reading of the Conceptual Sublime in the material, work of Barnett Newman. And by material work, I mean the history of that work, not merely, as it existed, before these acts of vandalism. But this narrative has to do with, a moment, a moment of mourning, following the death of my mother. And when my mother died, I was not immediately able to to relocate and mourn her loss, where she was, because of certain limitations that I had. And these were limitations of resource and limitations of responsibility, and so I wasn't present, where her remains were, and I wasn't present where the proximity of that mourning, would have had a logic, of space and time. And early on, from childhood, I had made these works in stone, and some of them were stone circles, and some of them were stacks of stone. And but I always had this idea of these stones that I played with as a child and made with as a child, that they were a kind of language. And I was late to writing because and I was late to reading because I have certain limitations in the way that I cognitively process and can inscribe letters and understand letters and perceive the relationships between figural representations of sound as words. And so these drawings in sand and these representations in stone, whether they were stacked stone or whether they were circles of stone or twigs, were always for me representations of language. And they were very primitive representations of language, but I would assign and create my creative imagination a certain linguistic value to this stick or that stone, and then I would assign a syntactical relationship to the organization of the work in space, and these might end up looking like mandalas in the sand, or they might end up looking like a heap of stones, or they might end up looking like a cairn or series of cairns, and this, in a way, I suppose, was one of my earliest performance artwork works, and it began even prior to my entrance into the public education system, and prior to my first years in school, and when my mother passed away, and I couldn't reach her where she was, where her remains were. I responded to my mourning with I began doing this piece of mourning in stone. Which was actually pretty extensive and lasted for a long period, and then developed into other relationships with other interests and political engagements that I had, but began with her passing and my response to it, and might not really, being capable of speaking or writing of it, but I could move these heavy stones, and I could create these works in which, the failure of my ability to speak, that failure of my inability to speak, or those moments in which, my voice and my words would fail, like I could get beyond that, and I could simply, remember the meaning of each stone, and the memory attached to each, that I conceptually, as in I had talked about Yoko Ono's imaginary nail in an imaginary wall, and my stones were real stones, but memories, were placed there in the same sort of conceptual way, and so this process, literally involved moving, not thousands of pounds, but thousands of tons of stone, and as I said, was part of my mourning process. And then when I finally reached, my mother's house, and was able to mourn in this place, I continued, doing that work, and some of that work, I did in one of the arroyos that, that was just beyond where she lived. She lived in this, in this home in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and so I had these memorials, and one day, I came to the arroyo, and all of these stones had been disassembled, and they were these graceful, balanced stones in the way that George Quasha's stones are gracefully balanced. Perhaps not as gracefully as Quasha's, because they existed in the real world, not in the museum space, in which they were subject to the vicissitudes of changes in the weather and motion, and they had to be stable enough to stand with some interference, and but they had all been disassembled and formed into this big heap of the shape of a cross, and it struck me very much like an act of vandalism, terrorism, and I thought about all of those instances in which grave sites are defaced, and who's doing the defacing, and it very much seemed to me that that the cross was used here as an act of more than vandalism, but terrorism. And I remember thinking, like I don't remember any stories of Brother Jesus, going to the synagogue or the tabernacle and tearing it apart so that he could make an image of himself in the sand. This seemed to me like to be antithetical of Christian ideal, right? And it struck me very much, this moment in which like this symbol had been used, like to as a form of terrorism, and maybe that moment, the relationship of the refusal of whoever did this to recognize the need of someone to mourn, and not understanding maybe what the limitations of their language or their ability to speak in that moment would be, because in times in which, like Newman, like how can you speak of these things, right? How can you speak of these things? So you find a language in which you manage to overcome your inability to use language, right? And for me, that was the simplicity of gathering these stones, which I could still do even when my voice failed, my arms and my hands did not fail, right? And my balance did not fail. but 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 being an act of mourning in the same way that the Newman is an attempt, to come to terms with these events. What does it mean to violate and to reinscribe, this terrorism? And to me, this poster, is an act that's very much in line with the Spanish, the principles of the Spanish Inquisition, and very much in line with those gestures of so I guess there's a difference between a priest and a holy man, and maybe that's why I don't understand what the significance of being a priest might be, but how someone like the Pope Pius XII could have had a relationship with Hitler and still pretended to be a Christian is unfathomable to me, and continues to be unfathomable. So what we're ending on is it is, as I guess, a description of an effort on my part to come to terms and to understand what distinctions we need to make in relationship to acts of iconoclasm that are representations of terror and the deployment of terror, whether that terror is derived from a holy symbol or otherwise, and what acts of iconoclasm, or if you want to even call them that, are acts of reparation, and in a certain sense virtue, right? You could argue that when Jesus Christ enters the temple with a whip and drives out those individuals who are profiting and profiteering, right, from the sacred, you could argue that that's an act of iconoclasm, right? And I think that it's very important to distinguish and have an understanding of the difference between calling attention to a history of violence in a dramatic fashion and engaging in an act of terrorism and hate speech and racialized violence in a destruction, that might look and appear on the surface as a similar type, right, of iconoclasm, but in fact, betrays a much more malignant and dangerous psychology of terror.